Good evening, members of the LGBTQI plus community. And actually, this year we're going TLGBIQ plus community. So, and our allies. Um, I will just open with some remarks to provide some context about Pride TT. And then I will hand you over, of course, to tonight's co host, Pride UE, and our main moderator, Shahan. All right. So Pride TT is all about highlighting the positive contribution of the LGBTQI community to Trinidad and Tobago's development. And this is our third year. As you can see, we have grown by leaps and bounds with your support and your continued participation. But what is interesting about this year is that Pride TT decided to play on the year 2020. So you will see in our communications, we are branding ourselves as Pride 20 2.0. And that 2.0 really signals that we are taking Pride to the next level. I have said elsewhere that protests, placards, parties, and parades have a place, but proactive engagement of our community through direct intervention initiatives is also critical, because while all of those wonderful things are going on, we do have members of our community who are either losing their lives, taking their lives, or not being able to live their lives. So it is important that an organization like Pride utilize its networks, its platform, and its resources to basically plan, develop, and execute some of these direct intervention mechanisms. One of those we launched on Sunday gone with Trans Coalition, which is the Sasha Fierce Memorial Fund, a first of its kind in this region, named after our dear tragically lost sister, Sasha Fierce, a known advocate for the trans community and persons living with HIV/AIDS. That's why we have the parade and fair at the Nelson Mandela Park every year, because of course that's where we lost her, and we find a moment where we can take that power back and bring life to a place where there was so much loss. That fund is actually going to benefit vulnerable persons in the trans community, and they can access funding for career development and skills advancement, and with the hope that they can become more empowered. And of course, that is in keeping with this year's theme, which is Be Empowered by Our Pride. And again, that is about being empowered not only by Pride, the organization and the celebration, but whatever pride you can find in yourself and in your community. And we hope to help you build on that and make it definitely a fantastic experience. The other elements to the theme of empowerment include the launch of the first ever LGBTQI business directory and skills database, as well as an artists database and a job seekers directory. These are other platforms that are also available through PrideTT.com, as well as being co-hosted by QueerTT.com. And as the names suggest, these are platforms that will allow you, members of the community, to build financial empowerment, because that is critical in this time. And without that, especially many of you who are in the arts and the culture sector, we know that you are suffering, and we want to do our part to at least try and build opportunities for our community to receive revenue and generate revenue. And we're hoping that once that database is fully developed over Pride, and that's what we're using, that's why I'm talking about it, because we're using every activity to promote it. So please go on and register. We will continue to then highlight that database and persons on it so that we can support our own in the community. And Be Empowered by Our Pride is also this year focused on political empowerment. As you know, it's an election year. And as some of you would recall, a few days ago, the Senate actually passed a bill, the Domestic Violence Act, but the opposition senators, they abstained from including same-sex couples in the bill, and the government actually voted against the amendment, while the independent bench voted for it. There are mixed opinions on whether that is a good thing or a bad thing, but the fact remains is that for far too long, the political directorate has ignored the LGBTQI community and other marginalized groups, and that is why we're actually having tonight's session, because we are giving them a chance to really step up and state clearly their position on these issues. We launched Pride as we normally do outside the Parliament, which is a nod to Jones versus TNT and Jason Jones, as we did in 2018. We always start there to remind the politicians and the legislature that we are here and we're queer and we're not going anywhere. But I would like to see more of you all out at events and on the calls. We need to show numbers. And we've promised them that this year we will be mobilizing in the marginalized seats, ironically, because that's probably the only marginalized thing that some of them care about. And we will be using our fingers to either vote for or against them. And having said that, I think I can now hand it over to Pride Yui. I think that's a perfect segue. And I've given you all of the context this year. Just again to remind you, as I said before we started recording, that Pride TT is completely funded by the community. We deliberately do not go to international funders because this is our Pride, and those funds have conditionalities on them. And we have also not gone to corporate Trinidad because we want to go to them from a position of power to negotiate. We do not want to sell out your queerness just for the money. So I'm asking each one of you to please contact us or visit our website and make a contribution. The funding goes directly into the programming and to support our infrastructure and some of our in-person shows, and will of course support this year's motorcade, which will replace the parade given the restrictions, as well as the fact that we want to take Pride out of the city center and throughout Trinidad and Tobago. And all of those things cost money. As you can see, every year we submit our annual report. We are very big on transparency and accountability here at PrideTT. And you can see in the report exactly where the money goes. I mean, you just need to count all of the events, and I'm sure you can do the math. We are Trinidad and Tobago and the Caribbean's largest producer of LGBTQI events and activities, and we would like to maintain that as we move forward. So having said all of that, Shahan and Wade, I'd like to hand it over to you, and you can take us through the rest of this evening. Thank you, everyone. Enjoy the discussion.
Hi, good night, everyone. I'm Shahan, PrideTT's PRO. So tonight is our first hashtag Queer Votes Counts town hall. Tonight we have our guest, the MSJ. We have Miss Karyn Diaz with us tonight. Um, just a brief intro to Miss Diaz. She's a scholar and an activist. One, I hope, is for the community seeing activism. She's also the secretary for the Youth of Social Justice and is currently pursuing her master's at the Institute of Gender and Development Studies at UWI. So she's also part of the IGDS family at UWI St. Augustine campus. So some quick ground rules before we start. Um, if you are not speaking, kindly mute your mic so we don't have the feedback, and your cameras if you don't want to be seen, because like Rudy said, we are live on Facebook as well. So with that being said, um, we hand the floor over to Karyn and she wants to give an opening statement.
Hi. Well, based on the proposed agenda, I'm allowed to make a brief statement of MSJ's position. Well, we want to wish everyone happy Pride. I know it's already the end of Pride, although we have some kind of Pride Month in the US, but I know we have some spillover here in our calendar. So essentially, MSJ is a social democrat party, and we believe that governance shouldn't be a top-down, centralized power sort of thing, but rather something where citizens are involved in the policy decisions that will affect their daily lives. As our name suggests, we see the value of social justice and activism. Social justice, like political engagement, is not just a right, but a responsibility that we all need to wield very carefully. As a community, we know that while this new version of Pride that we have is something that's very amazing, we also recognize that we've celebrated Pride for decades in our own way. And we want to really give a shout out to the CSOs, the civil society organizations that have been working on the ground, engaging in LGBTQIA plus activism, CSOs such as KAISO, Friends for Life, Alliance for Justice and Diversity, and Mantra. They have done a lot of work, and we have always supported them, and we will continue to support them, just as they have supported us. Because again, when you're looking at governance, you don't want to have a separation between civil engagement and political engagement. They need to be unified, they need to be one. And of course, we believe in intersectionality and the importance of looking at the complex interconnections among issues, right? So as a person who belongs to the LGBT community, we have to start thinking about our own little complications among ourselves. We should have our difficult conversations around class, gender, and ability, and how those different experiences mediate our experiences as queer folk.
Wow, that was an honestly. Okay, somebody, I am getting some feedback. I don't know where it's coming from. Thank you very much for muting. Okay, so that, as I was saying, that was an amazing opening statement. So, as Rudy said, we respect everyone's time, so I think we should get right to it. So, Karyn just basically went after my first question in terms of what does the party stand for. I believe she did. So we'll go to the second question. So Karyn, give us an idea of what the MSG has in store for the campaign trail for the 2020 elections.
Okay, so as you know, Trinidad and Tobago's political landscape is one where we have two major parties, and then we have several other what we'll call third parties, right? So MSJ is, I think, not even I think, I can confirm, MSJ is the largest third party. Previously, it was the Congress of the People, but due to different factors, we've kind of taken a bit of a lead. So we recognize that we may not have the means to contest every seat, so we're going to be focusing on 4 constituencies. And our slogan for this campaign period is essentially creating a balance, right? One of the problems we have when it comes to decision making in our government is that oftentimes, because of the way we vote, whoever wins elections tends to have a majority. It's very rare for there to be, perfectly split votes. And so what we are saying is that we might not be able to win government with 4 seats, but if we do take 4 seats, then neither party has a majority, and then they actually have to listen to the people to be able to negotiate and to be able to make decisions and to get decisions passed through Parliament and the Senate. That's it, basically.
Well, I'm at loss for words because I have never really heard a party being that straightforward, in other words, and saying that, they really want to become part of the government, in other words, so that they they need to listen to the people instead of how it is going right now. So another question, if you don't mind, if you had to review Trinidad and Tobago right now in the current economic state and the government itself in terms of how it's being run, what are your contributions personally and through the MSJ as well?
So I think one of the biggest problems with our current iteration of the political system is that until recently, and I'm talking within the last, let's say, 10 years or so, our parties have not been governed by clearly put ideologies. It has never been, in a place, for instance, that in the UK where you have your conservatives and then you have your Labour. It's always been just a matter of advocating for people's votes using a pack of promises that they don't actually fulfill when they do get into power. So for us, what we are thinking is that we want to engage in political education. We are not trying to, it's not, for us, it's not about jockeying for power per se. It's about empowering our population to make decisions no longer on the basis of red for life, yellow for life, but on the basis of how do these parties align with my ideas and how are they making decisions that will be beneficial to society as a whole. Because as it stands, because of the way we vote again, every 5 years, government changes, and it doesn't matter what party. They always try to undo what the previous government has done. And that leaves us, the citizens, in a very uncomfortable place. So I'm not even going to critique either party. I think they are both symbols or elements of the same system.
Follow-up question with that, with what you just said. Um, how is the MSJ different? Because speaking from living in a marginalized area, because I do live in a marginalized area, um, various parties, they come, they promise, they say they're gonna do such and such, but when they are voted into office, they don't follow up on their campaign promises. So, in terms of that, how is the MSJ planning on keeping their promises and not, in other words, letting power get the better of them? And how are you guys like different from the, in other words, the big political parties out there like the PNM and UNC?
So I love the tout MSG difference is that we actually have a political ideology. And we can actually point you to that ideology to give an idea of what exactly we want to achieve. And for instance, when we were contesting local government elections, it wasn't really about deciding what the community needed. We had several small town hall, but not, we call them cottage meetings. We had several cottage meetings at people's homes in different constituencies where we spoke to them and we wanted to find out from them what it is they wanted to see. And that was what we built our platform on for local government elections. Because at the end of the day, whatever we decide needs to be something that the people wanted. And honestly, I think we work very hard to hold ourselves accountable to each other. So, our discussions can get heated because we may not always agree on things, but we always come back to our main goal being leadership and governance for the people, by the people.
Okay. Well, I think I speak for all of us here who are on the Zoom and streaming live on Facebook that we do look forward to seeing what you guys have to offer in the different areas you are willing to contest. With that being said, topic on hand in the uprising in the country, and it was asked in terms of people just saying, and what do you guys like? What are your thoughts of what is the current situation going on in Trinidad right now in terms of the protests and such, and like how are you guys rallying the community so that it doesn't get too out of hand in that way, basically, how are you guys rallying behind the community in terms of that?
Okay, so MSJ wholeheartedly supports these uprisings. Okay, what we saw yesterday and what we saw today, this has been decades in the making, actual decades. And we have a close relationship with the communities where these uprisings are taking place, particularly Laventille and Beetham, where we had representatives for local government from those two areas. We think that folks would have tried to use the traditional, quote unquote, traditional avenues to express their issues, and they have not been heard. And in the words of Martin Luther King Jr., you know, a riot is the voice of the unheard. And so we stand with the people of these communities, and we recognize that their experience is one of classism and racism.
Yeah, well thought out, I must say. So I know in terms of some people tend to see it, some citizens, let me not use the word people, some citizens tend to see it differently. Like maybe they shouldn't be going along this route of the way how violent it is right now, and that it's impacting certain businesses and businesses in Port of Spain because of we recently had to shut down for COVID-19, and right when everything's starting back and hoping people get back, citizens get back on their feet with jobs and such, this happens. And in terms of the bystanders and stuff who really weren't part of it but are getting hurt, like how are you guys doing the pre-after work, in other words, the before and the after, in terms of casualties that weren't involved in the protest and people's lives being put at danger and cars and property getting bullet riddled or damaged while they are just going about their daily lives?
Okay, so that's a very complex question that looks at a very complex issue, but I think a good starting point to look at this whole scenario is to remember our own Trinidadian saying of who feels it knows it, who feels it knows it, right? A lot of us we don't live in these areas, we cannot comprehend what exactly these communities face on a daily basis, right? For instance, we had people in Mova today for their protests. They spoke with the people of Mova. It was a very peaceful, wonderful sort of gathering where, it became very clear that this demonization of these communities directly impacts the avenues that they have to be able to be heard, right? You can't marginalize a community and tell them that they don't matter and that they are not of value, and then expect them to believe that the systems that you govern will then serve them. And I mean, we know that a lot of times, the only way people listen is when you hit them in their pockets. I mean, this is why Rudy will often speak of the pink dollar, right? That, it's only when it hits economic levels that we start to think maybe we should really handle it so it doesn't become a bigger problem that will affect our bottom line.
Agreed. To, I guess, a certain extent, if I may be so bold. I I think we just concerned about, like, again, some are torn between, some are so in support of the protests and some aren't in support of the protests and some are in the middle because they understand why these areas are protesting and why they are seeking justice for the gentlemen that were murdered or killed by the officers. And then at the same time, for those who are in the middle, they don't see the idea behind the violence behind it. like the burning of tires in blocking the roads, especially because it's logically it's one way into Port of Spain and one way out of Port of Spain. Like we don't really have alternate routes. So for example, like blocking the highways, the Beetham highway, so pelting stones and debris at people's vehicles because they are either just trying to get into the capital to do whatever business they have to do, or just trying to get out because of what was happening. So it's like I said, people are agreeing to disagree. If
So
you know,
one thing I always like to point out when we critique. So first of all, there are two things I want to say. On the first hand, as I've said before, peaceful protest hasn't really been as effective, right? Even Pride itself would have started off with the Stonewall riots, where people would have said, why don't these people try to get what they want in a more peaceful way, right? But Stonewall riots is what made it possible, what made a lot of things possible, so that we can now celebrate Pride, so that people in New York can get married, that sort of thing, right? And you find that throughout history, there's always going to be an upheaval. And that upheaval will always happen when people don't feel heard. And I understand, if you aren't involved in this thing, you might feel like, well, why does it have to become my problem? But one of the things we fail to consider, and this is why intersectionality is so important, is that even though we might not be living in this community, so we might not be affected by unfair policing can come to us, right? And again, in the spirit of intersectionality, we have to consider that all of these issues are interconnected. We live in a society that is built from colonialism. We have problems talking about race, about gender, about sexual identity, about class, right? And I feel like a lot of the discomfort comes from those growing pains of being forced to see the reality of the hurt and the anger that some communities feel. And it's very scary to have to go through it, especially if you aren't actually responsible for it. But it requires a bit of grace. And I think that we have to be cognizant of the fact that they have been using the traditional means to be heard for decades, and they have not been heard. Because I need to point out, this is not the first uprising against police brutality. The entire Black Power movement of the 70s also tried to address police brutality because it has always been a problem. And if you have a policing system born out of a plantation society and you don't make changes to make sure that the inequalities that were built into a plantation society aren't brought forward, then we're going to wind up with what we are seeing now.
Hi, Karen. So it's Wade, the co-host, and I want to play a little bit of devil's advocate tonight. So I understand exactly what you're saying, and it's very factual that people who are underfoot will get fed up, and they're going to push that foot up from over them at some point in time. And as I say, I just want to get a little bit of devil's advocate. So one of the poorest regions in Trinidad and Tobago is Rio Claro. And I would like to know how and what is the MSJ's position on dealing with rural poverty. Most politicians will tell you that their solution is going to be agriculture. But I have been working with community-based groups in Rio Claro, and the young people, they are not interested in agriculture. They've moved away from that. They've actually migrated away from that. And there are other communities that are also economically challenged around Trinidad and Tobago, and they have said that they don't choose the option of violence. So what is MSJ's position on this? And finally, how does the MSJ plan to deal with promoting reconciliatory measures after this is over?
Okay, so that's a lot of questions. I'm going to just run them through. You want to understand how MSJ engages with rural communities. you want to understand how we plan to address the issue of policing. And you want to understand, what we say to communities who don't feel the need to protest in that way.
The second question, no, I'm not interested in the policing. I think policing is another topic that requires a lot of in-depth discussion, and the policing service in Trinidad and Tobago has many flaws for many different directions. And I think if we went down that route, we'd have a lot of chat about that. I'm interested in knowing, for the benefit of our viewers here, the position of reconciliation.
What does reconciliation mean?
So, and I'll give you a good example. Yep, I'll give you a good example of that. When you look at the situation in South Africa and the situation in Rwanda, those two communities were divided and driven into extreme levels of violence. And the only way that they actually went forward, and in the case of South Africa particularly, was when Nelson Mandela says, we cannot continue to hate each other, we have to forgive. And we have to work together to go forward, otherwise we will not have a nation. So that's my question to you. What is your role when it comes to promoting reconciliation? Because if we leave hostilities and we leave these feelings of animosities unresolved, nothing will change. Decades will come and decades will go, and we will still be in the same position.
Okay, so let's start with our position on rural communities. MSJ, actually, we contested in several what we would call rural communities. So for instance, we had a cottage meeting in Buenos Aires, which is very deep south. And the youth there also told us that they don't really have an interest in agriculture. So while MSJ has a position of encouraging domestic agriculture, we don't believe that, rural communities are the ones who need to take on that responsibility. Right? Just because you live in a place that's not in the capital or not in one of the major towns doesn't mean that you want to live a country bookie life, right? That is not what we're about. So, for instance, you mentioned the youth, and one of the things MSJ have been pushing for is to have, firstly, community-led cooperatives, where they engage in enterprise that suits the interests of the members and it suits the training and skills of the members. And for youth, we also recognize that youth in particular need to have their own cooperative spaces, because one of the things we have recognized is that, with our current capitalist system, a lot of the economic power is concentrated at the top, and the rest of us are forced to kind of fight for the scraps. And so youth to then run their own businesses together. In terms of reconciliation, we believe that reconciliation can only really happen through reform and social justice. So that means we're going to have a lot of very difficult conversations. And some of us are not going to be comfortable. It's going to be very uncomfortable for a lot of us, but that needs to happen. And then when we can agree that we have aired, our hurts and our issues, we then look at those things and we decide what we can do and how we can do it. But reconciliation will not happen if we sweep things under the rug. It needs to be something that, while uncomfortable, we push through and we continue to push through.
Wonderful, thank you.
Well said. There's one thing that you said, Karyn, that interests me or piques my interest. That is when you said that you guys had the MSJ, had the meeting in Buenos Aires, that's south, right? With the youth they're not interested in the agricultural sector. And you made the point that agriculture should not only be like for those who live in those areas, but city folk, in other words. But the thing is, right, certain city folk might not be interested in going into agriculture. So like how are you guys planning on bridging that bridging that gap? Because the way how you see it's stemming from the whole COVID-19 fiasco again, right? I'm using the word fiasco because it is really a fiasco, right? So the whole COVID-19 fiasco, and then our present government is saying that we need to rely on agriculture and the farmers and such. But it doesn't, yes, we have the land. What's currently left and does not have infrastructure or isn't landmark for housing and such. But then we have no one to go and develop that land to plant it. And another thing is the equipment for those to do those things are very expensive. So how are you guys planning on bridging that gap between city folk and rural folk who both may not want to take up that pedestal and the cost in which it will that will be undertaken to develop such land along those lines? How are you guys going to bridge that gap?
Okay, so that is, agriculture is one of the things that we care a lot about, not just because MSJ really came from working class folk, right? It wasn't, wealthy people trying to gain a little bit of political clout. These were working class people who felt like they needed better representation. And so we actually do have partners, MSJ partners, who are engaged in farming. And we, in our quest to push for greater domestic agriculture, we recognize that one of the reasons that our own domestic market kind of died out was because we began importing. And of course, our small agricultural sector they can't compete on the same scale as a multi-billion-dollar multinational company. And so we will be trying to create incentives for not just the farmers themselves to take up, agriculture for domestic use, but also for the retailers, because we recognize that the retailers are really the ones who can help navigate and mediate demand and supply. So we're saying that, retailers can be not asked, but mandated in whatever form. We can have a policy where retailers then purchase a certain percentage of local produce, right? Because you have to remember, this is what we're saying is that we're a small country, we're a small island developing state, and that means we have a lot of vulnerabilities. And if larger states like Germany can engage in economic protectionism, then we can do the same. And we can then promote our local markets before we promote international products. I mean, we've known that previous governments have pushed, the buy local trend, but that has not been as helpful as actually incentivizing people to buy local. Whether it is, we say, maybe you get some sort of tax benefit for stocking your shelf with local produce. Those are the sorts of ideas we're thinking about.
I got you. I got it. But then again, Trinidadians, speaking at the wide grasp, Trinbagonians, we are always going to um market the foreign products better than our own, because it's not like
though? Are we going to do that?
That is what happens. It always
So
happens.
let me point out a really cool thing that I realized over this lockdown period. So one of the jokes that came out of what's going on in the US in terms of the uprisings there is that, at the start of lockdown, everybody was really into baking bread. And then by the end of it, everybody was engaged in a social uprising. What in the world was in that bread? And I like to point out that over this lockdown period, a lot of Trinidadians have had the opportunity to engage in their own little domestic agricultural practices. You saw people really going at it in terms of developing their home gardens because of a fear, one, of imminent scarcity, and two, because now they have the time to do these things. And I think the critique of capitalism that, you know, our 40-hour week, for example, is something that isn't 100% necessary, but it wears people out to the point where they don't take action, is also valid for us here when we think about the ways in which we would do some of the things that we think we wouldn't do. We would engage in agriculture if we felt like, you know, we could make a living off of it, if we felt like we had the energy, if we didn't have to slug for hours at work pushing paper or dealing with disrespect from customers. If we had alternatives and we knew that they were good and that they had systems in place to properly protect all involved, we would do this stuff.
Agreed. I agree with you there.
And I think one of the things that we discount when we talk about how we move forward in terms of planning futures is that we don't even look at our children, right? It really only takes 1 or 2 generations for an idea to take root and to blossom. So if we start not telling children, because one of our goals is education reform, we are not pushing all of our children to become academics. That's not for everyone. We want a holistic education that will meet students where they're at and that will encourage them to follow things that they are interested in and that they are good at, right? And if we aren't telling children that, you know, you need to become a lawyer, doctor, engineer, scientist, but that, you know, it's just as good to become a farmer, just as good to become someone who runs their own small business, just as good to be an artisan, you are going to find that you're going to have children who will grow up, see the value of the agricultural sector, and engage in it. So it's going to require education in addition to incentivization.
I'm actually, go ahead.
Okay, Karyn. So I want to actually get into the meat of the discussion before our viewers leave us, because some of them don't stay very long. They have maybe to work in the morning, or I don't want to bore them with one single topic. So let's really get into the meat of the matter. We belong to the transgender, lesbian, gay, bisexual, queer, intersex, asexual community. And very often people will meet us on the street, politicians, they'll shake your hand and they'll say, I will do my best for you, I will represent your issues. They will even tell us, I don't have a problem with you, you know, and that in itself is a reductive statement, because then you tend to disqualify us. We sound as though we are a problem, but you don't have a problem. You don't have a problem with us. So what is different about the MSJ when it comes to our fundamental human rights? How do you plan to use those 4 seats, if you win them, to ensure that we are included in every piece of legislation, that we are included in every discussion that happens?
Okay, so that's a two-pronged. I'm going to give a two-pronged answer, and some of it is going to stem from some of my activism. So MSJ affirms unequivocally that the rights of the queer community are human rights, and they need to be recognized and offered the same protections under our laws, right? We were very supportive of the work done earlier this year, for example, by various NGOs and CSOs, where they lobbied to have the Domestic Violence Act amended. And we are very disappointed that senators refused to actually support including partners who are not married, or people who are not married but do live together and aren't linked by blood. Because we feel that that sort of amendment won't only benefit our community, but it will benefit, you know, siblings living together, 2 friends living together. It's not just, you know, LGBT people. And I think oftentimes politicians are very good at simply making you feel like you're being heard. You know, they'll hit you with the I hear you, I hear what you're saying, but they aren't actually listening. We actively try to listen. we have recognized that, of course, some of our supporters haven't gotten up to date in terms of, social justice issues, and we constantly work to educate on that. And we ourselves make a commitment to ensure that we create a space where everyone can feel represented. And even though we might not be able to form a government with 4 seats, as elected MPs, we can introduce motions, to help bring certain issues to light. And of course, we always partner with CSOs and NGOs doing the work on the ground. So KAISO, for example, and the Alliance for Justice and Diversity, for example, they have done a lot of work in terms of bringing out policies and in terms of educating the public on certain issues. And we will continue to support them and their ventures, and we will continue to liaise with them because we do believe in that civic political partnership.
So beyond the NGO engagement, I'm still unfortunately not convinced that your party is any different from any of the other parties, because they've done that. The People's Partnership and the PNM, they have regular consultations. They've, as a matter of fact, the current administration has done a series of community-based engagements. They've brought in civil society organizations, including the ones that you just mentioned, and they've asked about what they want. So my question to you, because what you're saying is you're actually saying that you're going to do the same thing that they're doing. So I'm not really convinced that anything is different.
Oh, I think one of the things that we have to, one of the risks, and I think this is actually something that influences a lot of voters, is that when you're dealing with a new party, it's very difficult to gauge how authentic they are in terms of their actions, in terms of what they say. But we have had our own internal talks, we have discussed what we would do. We would be happy to have to put forward LGBT representatives, right? And we believe that it's really important that people, it's a weird thing, but people have to actually give us a chance. You have to vote on good faith and then hold us accountable to make sure that we do what we promised you to do.
Okay. So tell me, just a little bit as an example, some of the things that the MSJ has in train in terms of plans of reaching out to our community. And I'll be very specific here. The transgender community is one of those that belong to the poorest sector of society. They face the most discrimination. They're the ones who are most vulnerable to violence. So even before you get into parliament or you get that vote, what does the MSJ have plans to reach out to our communities, especially the trans community?
So certainly when we do begin our election campaign with everyone else, we will be trying to engage in conversations with this community. I personally know about the Trans Coalition, and I also know about Trans and GNC, TNT. We have several smaller groups that operate on social media. And so we will be liaising with them to help us figure out, what actions we should take. But a lot of our policies, for instance, one of our key policies that we really wish our government, regardless of who actually is in power, would consider is the creation of, for instance, more shelters for young people. Because we realize right now, COVID and lockdown has actually brought to light a lot of the difficulties and exactly how tightly constrained our shelters are right now. A lot of them are full and they aren't able to satisfy the needs of a growing disenfranchised community due to all of what has happened with lockdown. And so we will be pushing for hostels, youth hostels, that sort of thing, where young people, young queer people can actually go for shelter if they are met with violence, if they are met with harassment, discrimination. We want to create those safe spaces for all of our vulnerable community members.
If I may be so bold, in terms of, you said that when your campaign kicks off, that you're going to liaise with the trans community. Now, I myself have been in talks with the trans NGCTT, right? The transgender non-conforming group, as well as Trans Coalition. We, in terms of their safety, it's one thing if you, as you go there and you, in terms of talk to them about how what needs to be met in terms of the transgender community, but you also need to take into consideration their safety. Their safety is the utmost priority, because people, in terms of
So in
outside
terms
of the
of
community,
safety, I think sometimes when we think of political leadership, we tend to get into a sort of cult of personality mentality, where we think that this one central figure needs to go to a community and interact with that community, and they need to work with an entourage of press. That is not what we're about, right? That's why we prefer to have our cottage meetings where it can be secure and intimate, and we can do more to protect the identities of the people who are sharing their views. Because we want to, in terms of, you know, the discussions we're having, we want to be sure that we also make these people, we create our own, we do what we say, we're going to create safe spaces for these conversations to take place.
So I see Brandy has a question for you, Karyn, and I also see that Rudy wants to ask a question too.
Okay,
so Brandy.
good night.
Hi, Brandy.
Hi, nice meeting you again. The panel, good night.
Hi,
I have a few questions and concerns really, because basically, I like the fact that I like what is stated and how the conversation is going. It's very empowered, but I want to also note that for any institution or any political party that wants to work with the trans community, I would want to make sure that we are included in the discussions and also around the table. I would
I'm not sure if
I think we have had.
Hello?
Are you hearing me?
Yes, I'm hearing you now.
Okay, I said I would want to make sure that we are trans persons is around these tables in terms of decision making, because there's a lot of times decisions are made for trans communities, and there are not the representations of trans persons being there. We have a lot of cisgender gay persons speaking on behalf of trans people, and this is something I think we need to stop and stand for. Trans women must be in that space where the decisions is being made, and to have dialogue and making choices for trans women. And so far, so good. I'm listening to what is being said, but I just want to make sure that my voice is being heard, because along these lines, I want to make sure that we understand that when you're making decisions, we are included around that panel and around that table.
So that is an excellent point, and that's why I would have said earlier that, you know, we are very open to running LGBT candidates, and we would do the work to support those candidates, because as you said, we don't want to make decisions for people. We need to recognize that people themselves know what they need and know what they want, and all they need is a platform, and that's what we're trying to give people.
I have a question.
Hi.
Hi, Karen. This is Faye. Good night. Sorry I
Hi,
came
good
a bit
night.
late. I'm not sure if this was discussed, but I looked into your 21 policy positions, and you're stating that you would love to have, sorry, MSJ would love an LGBT candidate if possible. But how can that happen if your policy statement doesn't even include sexual orientation? Is it somewhere in the policy that I might have missed it? But you said, or should I say, your organization has in its policy statement, these positions provide the basis for the implementation of a new plan of action for governing Trinidad and Tobago and its people, regardless of race, religion, gender, age, geographical location, sector, or party affiliation. It sounds to me very much like what we have right now, in that our Equal Opportunities Act does not cover sexual orientation, nor does our Constitution. So how can you say to me and have me believe what you say to be an accurate position, or make me even want to join MSJ or to support MSJ, when I clearly do not see sexual orientation covered in your policy position?
That's an excellent question, Faye. So two things essentially. The first thing would be that that policy decision is a bit old, because I'm assuming it's the one you pulled from the site, right?
It says 21st century, and I think the beginning of the document says 2020.
Okay. So
No, you're right. It's dated 2014, correct?
yeah. And since then, we have done a lot of growing, and we have had discussions about including everyone in what we say, right? Which is why we have constantly supported the CSOs, because we believe that the work that they're doing is very important. And so we are in the process of revising those policies, because of course we're living in a very different time than we were in 2014. And a lot of growth has happened within our organization to create space to be more inclusive.
Okay, so are you telling me that your organization will put out a new policy document, or at least a manifesto, before elections?
Yeah, we're definitely putting out a manifesto. We'll definitely be sharing our views on what we think needs to be done in order to serve our wider community.
You know, because one of the issues that we at the LGBT community has is housing. Housing,
So,
insurance.
I mean,
I know in one of your policy documents, housing is number 5. So it's pretty high. It's even higher than infrastructure and transport. So I would really like to see something in there for our community.
When I mentioned, for instance, the shelters, that is for that reason. And similarly with the co-ops, we are looking for ways to empower people themselves. Housing is one of the, I mean, Trinidad is a small place, so it's very complex, but it's one of the biggest issues affecting us. And we want to be able to ensure that no one, not especially no one from the LGBT community, is without a home. Because we saw what happened after the Jason Jones ruling, right? And we condemned it then. We saw, you know, people being put out of their homes for no other reason than the fact that their landlord or their families didn't agree, quote unquote, right? Which is a terrible excuse and a terrible justification. And so we want to make sure that the LGBT community, we want to make sure, for instance, that the Equal Opportunity Act, which would then address some of the housing discrimination that LGBT people face, is updated to include what some of these NGOs have asked for, to include sex and gender identity, to include age, and to include health status, whether somebody is pregnant, living with HIV, living with chronic disease.
Do you all have any sort of draft policy or whatever with regards to, under the housing that you have, with regards to folks being able to afford a house? Because let's look at Tobago for what. I don't think 90% of Tobagonians can own a home. or even think about owning a home right now at the prices that they are. Even here in Trinidad and Tobago, sorry, in Trinidad, middle income people cannot afford a home, cannot afford the loan, cannot afford the prices. That's why we have such a long waiting list for HDC.
Right. So what we will be doing is, again, because what we have noticed, for instance, is that it's not as bad as in the US, but there's a fair amount of property speculation in Trinidad and Tobago, where people do purchase, land, and they develop apartments, and they inflate the value of land. And so we are going to be putting things in place to ensure that our housing policy addresses those things and makes it more possible for everyone to purchase homes. Because it's not just middle income people who can't purchase homes, but the poorest of us, myself included, can't purchase homes. And so we want to make sure that housing as a human right is given to everyone.
Yep.
Okay, guys, if I may interject here. Uh, so with respect to the housing and shelters and stuff, right? Typically the shelters that you're talking about, Karen, typically shelters are temporary, right? And I do not know of the situations in which one can be accommodated in a shelter in Trinidad, but from what I have seen, and that is on TV, is that shelters, you come one day, you have to leave and come back to see if there's space and such. Again, I don't know if that's the situation in Trinidad and Tobago. However, you could answer that question in a sec. And another question I pose to you is that how will we face discrimination? As Faye rightfully said, and as you, Karen, rightfully said, we the TLGBT community plus community, my bad, we face a lot of discrimination. So per se, if we weren't able to purchase a house or we don't meet the criteria, still we're going to get landlords being discriminatory toward us. One, if we do not come out rightfully so sign the contract to say, okay, we are part of the community, but if our partners and such are seen coming over to our apartment to visit us, to your partner ain't going, they in terms of categorizing, they're not just going to come over and visit and want to leave. They might want to, let's say, spend a couple of days and such, and they may not sign the lease. But we will face a lot of blowback, in other words, because we are part of the community, and we may even face eviction. So how is the
So,
MSJ planning on curbing that?
so that's why we are pushing for the amendment of the Equal Opportunity Act. So that when a landlord decides that an LGBT person should not be allowed to do something in a property they have rented and then therefore have authority over for the duration of their lease, they can then report that to the Equal Opportunity Committee and seek redress. Because one thing, and this is me on a personal level now, I have found that landlords in particular, they take on a very authoritarian role towards their tenants. They have a lot of superfluous, unnecessary rules. And one thing we would want is to have an updated rental board so that if you are renting a property, you are offered protection, there are standards in place, and that there are consequences for breaching your rental contract, for your landlord in particular breaching their end of the rental contract, because there are lots of nightmare stories about renting with terrible landlords.
Understood. And stemming from the act in which you quoted, we're just taking a further progress because we can't really stick on one specific topic for the night. But I think the TLGBTQ plus community, and we're putting the T as we often in front because we often don't recognize our transgender family. So we're doing this reapproach and putting the T in front just for explanatory reasons for viewers and everyone else. What laws do you plan to, you know, try to get passed? In other words, even though you guys are only contesting 4 seats, but that will sort of equal out in terms of opposition, government is just two different parties, but you will be, hopefully, if you guys win, it will be three different parties in the Senate. So, like, give us an idea of what laws or what amendments you guys plan on putting forward for the community itself, because in discussion with others, I think everybody is, the big thing is same-sex marriage or marriage in terms of the community. Um, Another thing is that if you marry same-sex or again within the community, like the health insurance, the NIS, those kinds of things, like how are you guys planning on putting things in place so that, let's say I get married, if my spouse or my wife, in other words, would be able to be under my health plan instead of she having to take out her own health plan? You know, how are you guys planning on putting things in place or talking to, the insurance companies to get all those things passed? Because there is going to be a lot of blowback to the community, because in hindsight, we always face a lot of blowback for things. Sometimes we do and sometimes we don't even do. But that's a couple two of the big questions that I personally would like to pose to you.
Okay, so we recognize that blowback will wind up being one of the major sites of contention. And I want to point out that my comrade Angelo is also in the chat, so he's also sharing his perspectives, right? But because of that blowback, we want to be very strategic about how we go about it. We want to have protections in place, first of all, before we start pushing for the major legislation. Because without those protections, we're going to see that backlash we saw in 2018, where people are kicked out from their homes, where their jobs, where they are met with violence. So we want to make sure that our protective measures are firmly in place before we start pushing for other legislative change. So we want to make sure our shelters are up and running. We want to make sure the Domestic Violence Act is amended. We want to make sure the Equal Opportunity Act is amended before we move on to those bigger questions. Because, I mean, one thing Rudy and I have said when we've gone on air previously is that there's a lot of fear-mongering surrounding the quote-unquote gay agenda. You know, this thing that these global north evangelicals push, that, we have this sinister agenda to take over the world. We, as a community, this is what we said, we're not pushing for marriage right now because there are so many more pressing issues that we have to deal with, specifically housing, specifically protection under the law, specifically ensuring that the police treat the members of the community with the respect and dignity that we all deserve.
Okay, so I am posing this question because, again, our transgender family have been they face a lot of violence. So with that being said, and you saying that you want the police to treat us equally, but still, in terms of, they are going to be officers thinking logically and within the country and its parameters. They are going to be officers who do not agree with our lifestyle, do not agree with certain people being transgender, and they are going to misidentify the persons and not going to, in terms of deal with people or respect them under which the gender which they are referring to themselves as. So let's say this person was born as a man, right? And they transition to become a woman. Now, the police may not treat this person as a woman because, for whatever reason, because maybe the ID card may not say that. So, in terms of transitioning, because we have to remember that if we transition, right, we the things that have to transition with us is stuff like our ID card, our driver's permit, our passport as well, because we can't be we can't be a woman in person, but our documents say otherwise. And I correct me if I'm wrong, anybody on this call or anyone for that matter, I don't think there are any things in place for, let's say, you transition to rectify your documentations, your legal documentations, so you could be identified as the proper gender.
Sorry.
So let me go ahead, Brandy.
Right. Because I was just going to ask along the same lines in terms of sexual orientation and gender identity. My gender mark, it is not really a law, it's not legislative, but it's just a matter of it being is something that to be there that doesn't really demand a law to be there. What I'm saying is that how does your party views gender identity and the gender marks on national identification? Because from time to time, as the host was just speaking on behalf of um, how your package in terms of presentation and what your personal states, it would be something totally different. There's nothing in place to support that gender mark. And of course, we know that there's education in the system, because from time to time, if you don't go to the same bank all the time, every time you meet a new teller, they have to raise up the eyes, to look at your gender mark. So these are things that we want to have this kind of conversation around. And what are your views and what your party views are in terms of that?
Okay, so let me start with what our host was asking, and I want to clarify. You want to know how MSJ plans to create the conditions to support the trans community.
Support and respect is one of the most important.
So I think you raised the point, for instance, of the fact that even if we do change legislation, there will be people within an organization who hold on to their homophobic views because we know, and transphobic views, because we know that a lot of the global north anti-queer ideology is clung closely to here because of religious reasons. It's making sense. But what we are saying is that when you reform, for instance, policing, to say that you protect and serve everyone, not just people who conform to your idea of respectability, but you protect and serve everyone. If you do not meet those responsibilities to treat the people with respect, you then need to be held accountable for your actions, right? Right now, we know that the Police Complaints Authority, for example, is speaking out about how muzzled they are. And in our police reform, we would want to make sure that people feel confident and empowered and protected enough to be able to report when they are misgendered, when they are met with derision and hostility. But to be able to achieve that, we first need to make sure that sexual and gender identity is firmly placed within the Equal Opportunity Act. This Equal Opportunity Act is really one of the key pieces of legislation that our community needs to be able to use to ensure that the most vulnerable among us are protected. And so in terms of, for instance, tellers, now this is something that we're still talking about, because tellers, of course, banks are private firms, but we want to have a similar reporting system in place, right? We want to make it clear that if you, as if an agent of your private institution, engages in discriminatory behavior, you will be examined under the Equal Opportunity Act, and you will be held accountable if you are found to be engaging in discrimination.
Karyn, good night. Eva here. I just want to go back a little bit on a question that was asked previously about the acts, the laws that we want. One of the questions was about gay marriage, and you spoke about the gay agenda that everybody thinks that we're fighting for, right? The question was posed to you as a representative of the party MSJ, but you answered under the guise of your NGO-ship. So, and I'm asking this because some people, while some of the NGOs do not agree that some people don't want to get married, I don't think that's the view of everyone. I would love to get married to my wife in this country. We are married.
I mean, to get legal recognition. So we definitely support that. And again, and I keep hammering this home, we have to make sure the protections are in place before we start pushing for these things. Because, let me give an example, right? In Martinique, for instance, they did actually allow for, well, it's not same-sex marriage because France had a weird thing, but what they found was that people were still not inclined to actually go and get married because there was still this cultural taboo. And so what we will be doing, because we are pushing for educational reform, we will want to have a curriculum that prioritizes and fully affirms the personhood of everyone. And so through those public education campaigns and through our traditional educational campaigns, we will be trying to then plant those seeds that anybody who wants to get married should be able to get married. Hi, Faye, I'm seeing your hand.
Yes, Faye, go ahead. Ask a question, Faye.
So, school and teaching is a big deal for me. I think that's where our country needs to and could have its biggest impact to change the future.
Agreed.
And I see that teaching and the entire education system is a big deal for MSJ. What I didn't see, and as you have pointed out to me, it's an old policy document that is on your website. What I didn't see in it then, and I'm not sure if you're looking at, where does sexual education fall under within your policy? Is it important? I see it as being important, one, because when we have 11-year-olds bringing children into this world, we cannot continue with a minister of education that says sexual education really and truly does not have a place in our education system. When we have bullying going on with someone's perceived sexual orientation and children making fun of them, we have a problem. When we have youngsters that are being abused, as we are in this country, and the latest case being the 27-year-old police officer and a 15-year-old girl in Tobago, it is a big problem. And I think sexual education, and we have been calling for sexual education, and the biggest NGO to do that right now is Silver Lining, with their push for bullying and so forth. Where does the MSJ sit as far as sexual education in the education system?
Yeah, so as Angela is pointing out, we will be pushing for sex and gender education and about sexuality and about relationships, because I think a lot of times we try to treat all of these things as very separate things. So we want to have a separate anti-bullying campaign. We want to have a separate campaign for healthy relationships. We want to have a separate campaign for safe sex. We want to have a separate campaign for understanding ourselves and our sexuality. And we are saying that right now the government of the day had proposed, well, not this one, actually not this one, now the previous government. The previous government proposed a home and family life education program that never really got off the ground. But we will be pushing for that because part of holistic education will include social education and ensuring that we recognize our differences and we realize that our differences are exactly what will make us stronger as a community. And so we want to educate our children about, safe sex, having good relationships, learning to deal with conflict, because that is something we as Trinidadians are not particularly good at, learning about ourselves. And I mean, some schools do it right now, but they use a lot of privately developed curricula that often have a religious slant. So for instance, in Tobago, they actually do have a health and family life education program, but it's very Christianity based. And whatever we propose when we do engage in our education, if we ever get to the point of having a majority vote, that is, when we do push for our educational reform, we will be looking to include sex education in all our attempts at education reform. Because I know a lot of research has focused on MSM and HIV, but we have realized that, because we refuse to have sex education, it's not only LGBT children being shortchanged, but young girls are targeted by men like the police officer that you said. And so we want to make sure that all our children are equipped with a knowledge that empowers them to make good, healthy, sustainable decisions about them, their relationships, and their bodies.
Okay, so I'm looking forward to seeing MSJ's manifesto and seeing these things in it.
Okay, guys. Rudy, I know you want to ask a few questions, but if you could just indulge me now, like 2 minutes. Sohan posted a question, and I'm going to read it exactly from his words. Karyn, this is for you. Sohan said, I am a public known performing drag entertainer in Trinidad and Tobago. Will the MSJ be bold to having a drag entertainer on their campaign platform?
I think that's an interesting question. It would require some discussion from the board and the different members. But I do think that our part of our education has to be surrounding, accepting people and their differences. And so I personally, as a member of MSJ, would be very happy to see it happen. And I am sure that there are members who might have a lot to say, and that's their problem, but we will have to decide something as a unit. It's a very interesting question that has not been posed to us before.
Okay, so I trust that you would bring that up with your board and hopefully get back to us with that answer. Rudy, you had a couple questions. So the floor is all yours.
Thank you, guys. So, Karyn, you raise a lot of interesting points that also relate to our work. So just to give some context, and then I'll ask you, you spoke about building communities, the fact that people have to work together, that sometimes there's need to be more confrontational and not as academic and passive about activism. And you referenced the uprisings that are going on right now. And we also have that challenge within our work because there are people within the existing space who would like things to go a certain way. As a matter of fact, on the call we had on Knowing Your Legal Rights on Monday, Jason Jones himself publicly stated that existing NGOs and CBOs in this space were actually fighting him down and spreading propaganda and really not uniting as one body. And I think that we have witnessed that as well, where people have really been focused on personality issues rather than the community and the fact that people in Brandy's community, for example, are being abused and dying. And even though there's, as I said earlier in the call, even though there's a lot of placarding and protesting and stuff going on, our community is still suffering. I mean, we lost some of our members last year, even during Pride, and the police haven't done anything about it. And I'm bringing all of that up to say that it's a microcosm of the wider society, in that we are very fragmented. We focus on things that at the end of the day are keeping us divided and letting other people keep us divided. As a political party, I'm sure MSJ sees this. Some of your competitors in the political guile, they do this very well. And they attack people's personalities, they throw ad hominem attacks, they talk about race and classes, they fuel things. As a political party looking to set yourself apart, what do you say to the wider community? What do you say about these issues, and what is your call for genuine unification as one people to really get our goals achieved?
So this sounds like it ties back to Wade's question of reconciliation. And again, the MSJ position is that we are going to need to have some very difficult conversations about the different ways our lives are mediated through class, through race, through religious affiliation, through age, through ability. And from there, we use that understanding of where each of us is at to then decide on how all of us can move forward. So we are all about tough conversations, letting everyone be heard, letting their views be respected, and then using what is said in those difficult conversations to form the basis for future action.
So some people see, because I mean, full disclosure, I'm involved in, I have been involved in political activism, for those who don't know. And I'm asking this question from that lens. They're in much the same way that other parties are viewed, or they have a, whether right or not, there's a perception of who that party represents. Would you say, what would you say to people whose perception is that the MSJ does not represent the middle class, or who they might see as privileged in society, when in fact the middle class has a very important economic function in society, and right now is being squeezed most heavily to support both welfare programming and to subsidize the lifestyle of the richer people in society? What is the MSJ's position? Are you only for the working class and the underprivileged, or do you also represent middle class and aspiring upper class privileged citizens of Trinidad and Tobago?
So I think that the truth is that MSJ is a social democrat party. And as a result,
just to be clear.
So social democrat essentially means that we want to achieve, a more socialist society through democratic means, through political engagement, through, organizing and that sort of thing. And that places us firmly in the left-wing window. And as a left-wing party, we are going to be very aware of how class, thanks, Siobhan, of how class becomes one of the major axes through which our realities are constructed. And so it may not be the ideal response, but ultimately, because if you look at, for instance, a lot of socialist discourse now, we don't really recognize a middle class. You have working class people, and then you have capitalists. You have people who have the economic wherewithal to roll the capital, right? And so we are trying to make sure that working class people, whether they fancy themselves as middle class or not, working class people have fair representation and the same access to resources and opportunities as can be afforded by someone who has more money.
So On that, I'm giving you a platform here for a minute before I ask my last one or two questions. What would you say to middle class people, especially middle class Black people in Trinidad and Tobago? Because we've all been seeing the commentary on social media and even in the newspapers, the traditional press, where there seems to be this dichotomy and this rush to judging people in Laventille and painting people with a brush and not understanding the complexities of the lives that those people, their lived experience. Take this platform. What would you say to those middle class people, in particular, who don't seem to see the connection between them getting involved and standing with these people and trying to understand and work with them? What would you say to them as a political party, as a leader, someone trying to lead the country to a better future?
I would say that the strength of a society is measured by the reality of the most vulnerable within that society. And that when we make decisions that benefit the most vulnerable in our society, almost always everyone else benefits from those decisions, from those policies. And so instead of adhering to this notion of trickle-down economics, we want to talk about vertical growth and how supporting, our working class can lead to change that benefits everyone wherever they're at.
Fair enough. My second to last question, you touched on it a little bit earlier, but just to get some clarity on religion and faith. Now, LGBT, TLG, Brandy, forgive me, we're getting used to it, right? TLGBTQI plus people are also members of faith. And I think in some conversations, the religious right would have people believe that we are not. And we know all the tropes and the allegations that they throw at us. And you mentioned before that you and I have spoken elsewhere about this, but as a representative of the MSJ, we know that the religious right has a powerful, or at least has had a powerful impact on politics in the past. We've heard other parties talk about it. How does the MSJ balance the interests of persons of faith who have a particular, and I don't want to broad brush all of them, but most, it seems, or at least a good number of them, have a very negative view to persons in the TLGBIQ community? What would you say to them again to bring us together for a better Trinidad and Tobago?
Okay, so that's why we really want to push for the amendment to the Equal Opportunity Act, because we will be pushing for educational reform, and that will tackle, because I work in a school right now, and it's not as bad as when I was in school 15 or so years ago, right? There are a lot more encouraging children, and Silver Lining has done a lot of work that has made it possible for teachers as well to stand behind those children who are sexually diverse, who are gender diverse. And so, coupled with our public education, if we have the legislation in place that offers the LGBT community protection, then people, because we can't, insert ourselves into people's brains and change their minds. Education can only go so far when people decide to be bigots. And so they could think what they like, but then if they do something that harms an LGBT person, or that they remove access for an LGBT person, there will be severe consequences for whatever that action is.
And that brings me to my last question. So, yes, we have said it ourselves, for 30 years, Trinidad and Tobago celebrated Pride. Even our elders, though, have told us they did it more in private than what we do now. And again, I have to reference the fact that fear is an insidious thing. And there was fear around having a public pride, if I can term it that, for the simplicity of the discussion. And we know that over the years, there will always be fallout in the community. And you mentioned it before in relation to Jason's case. And yes, there were reports of people being discriminated against. And you've been very clear on your position about the EOA. What we have found is that notwithstanding decades of work that has taken place, many people in the LGBTQI community still are not familiar with the representative bodies. They don't know where to seek advice and support and representation. And they also see, as I mentioned before, a lot of fragmentation. And interestingly enough, many of those persons have united under the PrideTT umbrella. And we, of course, maintain an open door for all related parties to partner with us to utilize our platform, basically. Because right now, as we speak, this discussion has reached close to 2,000 persons on only one of our Facebook Lives. And it could probably reach to even more, as the one last night did. We are developing throughout the entire month of Pride a needs assessment that will feed into what we are calling an empowerment manifesto. And it will not only deal with LGBTQI issues, but it will deal with other marginalized issues. Can I put you on the spot tonight and ask you directly, when that document is completed at the end of Pride Month, will the MSJ accept it and give it not just lip service credibility, but will it actually take some of those requests that come out of this survey and include it in your manifesto? Karyn, you're probably on mute, but unless silence is your answer.
Okay, so as I was saying, definitely we will graciously accept this needs assessment empowerment manifesto, and we will certainly be including some of the points that you raised, because they are points that we have raised among ourselves as well. I'm sure some of them will be points we have raised among ourselves. And so we will definitely be using some of what you say to ensure that our manifesto, as it addresses the needs of this community, does reflect what the community actually wants.
There you go, folks. You heard it live first on Queer Votes Count Town Hall. Shahan, thank you very much. Back to you.
You're most welcome, Rudy. Karyn, we do have a couple questions from our fellow Zoomers, if I may refer to you all as Zoomers, not the snack, no pun intended. This question is from Nikhil, and he asked, does the MSJ have any policies or planning regarding sexual assault, particularly with respect to protecting victims and prosecuting perpetrators, as the current relevant authorities do not have a very good track record of either protecting or prosecuting? How does the MSJ propose to improve upon this, if the party has any plans at all?
Yes, so we actually, for us, a lot of our policy plans tend to span multiple issues, right? So in terms of, for instance, our response to domestic violence, we want to make sure, because right now we recognize that a lot of organizations have actually, they deal with severe underfunding. So we want to make sure that organizations that support victims of domestic violence receive better funding, right? And then we also want to engage in police reform, because the police, they also have a role in addressing domestic violence complaints. So for instance, we want to deal with the stigma surrounding male victims of domestic violence. We want that when somebody goes to the station to report a threat or to report that they're being abused, that the police act swiftly. And if they don't act swiftly and they don't act appropriately, they do face severe consequences for their inaction. And then we also want to have our hostel so that children who may face domestic violence, who may face sexual abuse, can be protected. And finally, we do want to make sure that at the end of the day, the prison system is overhauled, because we send our offenders to prison with, a focus on punishment, and we aren't focusing on reform. And so these people go in for the crime of domestic violence, abuse, sexual assault, and they aren't actually, their issues aren't addressed. So they come out at the end of their sentence to return to the cycle of violence that they have propagated. And so we want to make sure that our prison system is reformed so that people can then feel like if you commit a crime and you go to prison, you're going to come out better and not in exactly where you were before, or as is often the case, further back and in a worse state than where you were before.
Okay, follow up to that, because that I believe how you answered that was generally in terms of the wider community. But like, what are your plans, your meaning the MSJ plans, concerning the question that you just answered, specifically in light of the LGBTQIA plus community? Because often
right, so that's where these shelters will come in. So for instance, EOA is amended. That means discrimination is illegal. Domestic Violence Act is amended. That means that same-sex partners, people who live together, trans people can all get a protection order in a timely manner electronically. They can get protection, and they are allowed to report to multiple sources, right? So assuming those things are in place, because that's what we're lobbying for first, then we can create our shelters for LGBT youth, where we have trained professionals who will then address the needs of these youth and who will help them, get a way to get on their feet, right? Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you so much for answering that question. Another question Faye asked is that David Abdullah and Aaron McLeod have been involved with the labor movement before getting involved in politics. What is the policy or plan to get protection for the TLGBTQIA persons in the workplace into every employee's handbook?
Right, so I feel like I'm probably, doing a lot of work for the Equal Opportunity Commission here. But step one would be amending the Equal Opportunity Act, so that if you are discriminated on your job site, you then have the grounds to seek legal recourse for that discrimination. Personally, the labor movement has always tried to be inclusive, right? And I will point out, as Angelo had, that the MSJ is not just Mr. Abdullah and Mr. McLeod. We have people from multiple sectors involved, and we do take into account their needs as working class people. And because we are interested in the concerns of working class people, we are going to do everything in our power to make sure that everyone, especially on the job site, is offered adequate protection and adequate representation.
Okay.
But one does not have to wait for the EOA at this moment for that. The Ministry of Labor has documents stating that no one should be discriminated in the workplace because of their sexual orientation. And getting it into the employee handbooks is probably the lowest hanging fruit.
Certainly we can, sorry about the dogs barking. Certainly we can advocate for that in the public sector, because the public sector is under the control of the government. And we would certainly want to advocate for that from now. The issue becomes with the private sector, where we have a lot less control. and where we then need to make sure that our legislation is in place to make sure that those private sector employers do also respect the rights of the LGBT people in their workplace.
Yes, because I was just looking again at that old policy document that you all had where you all intended to do so much with labor and you all were asking something, but I did not see at all any place where it stated what you were going to do with regards to that. So that's why I asked.
So I hope that that would have answered your question based on the policy, the old policy.
Well, somewhat in the sense that,
yeah.
Go ahead.
So basically, because we are a party that is trying to address the needs of the working class and then use the working class as the base for a broader, more egalitarian society, we recognize that all vulnerable workers need to be protected. And so we want to advocate for all vulnerable workers to be protected. And it might sound like we're excluding the LGBT community, but we're not. We are including them just as we want to include migrant workers, just as we want to include domestic workers.
But having said that, I mean, there is a policy on migrant labor under your labor and social security. So if as I say, you're pointing this out, but I'm not seeing anything that says that you are going to. You're telling
again,
me,
because you're reading an old policy. So we're hoping when we do put out a new policy, I would be very happy to send it to you if you would share your email address with me privately.
I will. I'll drop it in the chat right now for you.
Hi, Karyn. So I have a question here. So quite a bit of the discussion that you, when you're talking about this change that you hope to implement surrounds addressing the Equal Opportunities Act. But what other pieces of legislation would be a low-hanging fruit for the MSJ should you enter into Parliament with those 4 pieces?
I think right now, low-hanging fruit for us, especially given what has been going on within the last few days, will probably be to push for greater police accountability. Because that becomes one of the sites where a lot of people are underserved and a lot of people encounter harm. So that is going to be one of the things we will be actively pushing for. Police reform, greater accountability for the police, and also we want to ensure that people themselves are aware of their rights. So that's why we have been engaging in Know Your Rights sessions and educating the public on our political systems and how things work, so that people themselves can then see what we are trying to achieve.
Okay, and then I have one more question to ask. When it comes to those pieces of legislation, for example, the Immigration Act, that continues to remain in place. Governments say that they're not going to use it, but it sits there. And once a piece of legislation says something, even if a minister instructs the immigration department not to do something, an immigration officer can enforce the law once it's there written, and he can ignore whatever a government minister says or whatever a chief of immigration officer says, because it's the law, and those laws need to be addressed. So there are few other pieces of legislation in Trinidad and Tobago that still continues to discriminate against us.
Right. So I think one of the ways that the government of the day, because decriminalization would have been passed in 2018, and then our esteemed Attorney General would have said he wanted to appeal it because, according to him, he wanted to make it irrefutable. And I think once that appeal process ends, then we would have to harmonize all of these laws to ensure that they conform to what the actual decriminalization law entails. Because we recognize that our current legislation, for the most part, has been borrowed wholesale and has stayed mostly unchanged since it was written and borrowed in 1962. And we really need to update our legislation to serve the needs of all of our citizens and to serve a very different context than what was existing in 1962.
Okay, thank you very much. And finally, the last question I'm going to ask you for the evening, just to segue away from the discussion here. I'm a really big supporter, and many members of the Brandy, QIA community, we believe very strongly in climate change and climate action, because people tend to see us as this myopic group of people who only care about our rights and having sex with each other. What's MSJ's policy when it comes to climate action? Not climate change, but climate action.
So we believe that we need to take very decisive actions in terms of how we respond to climate change. Because as a small island developing state, we in particular face a lot of vulnerability to climate change. Because if we do decide, if our agricultural sector flourishes as it once did, then that sector will be, of course, very vulnerable to climate change. And so we want to put things in place to mitigate some of the problems that will arise as a result of climate change. Now, one of the things that we recognize is that, a lot of pollution is being done. Now, Trinidad had a lot of pollution per capita. Yeah, I think we topped the global list of countries with the highest amount of pollution per capita, right? And what we will want to do as part of our campaign is to start looking at how we can reduce our consumption of things like fossil fuels. We want to convert to things like, solar energy, wind and wave motion energy. We want to start looking at alternative energy options. We want to start looking at the way in which we produce. So we want to have, if we manage to revitalize our manufacturing sector, we want to make sure that we have very clearly defined standards for operation. We don't want to be like the US where they're rolling back EPA protections at this time. We want to
Quick question. Did that answer your question, your last question posed towards Karyn?
I think I see the direction that they're talking about. I would have been a little more encouraged just to hear that they actually had a concrete policy when it comes to engaging civil society and the average person on the street and making a personal contribution to climate action. That's what I meant by climate action. It's not just a policy about battling climate change, but getting people to take responsibilities, personal responsibilities.
Okay, so, and that's where again education will come in, because at our core, we believe that education is an essential vehicle through which all social change will take place. And so we educate people about climate change, because honestly, I remember growing up and seeing a lot of, ads and programs on TV6 and TTT talking about climate change, talking about the environment. And somewhere along the line, we stopped having these campaigns where we educated young people about the environment and about their civic responsibility to preserve the environment. And like littering. Littering is one of the basic ways that we could we could reduce the negative impact of climate change, because we know that the littering leads to flooding. Previously, there were lots of campaigns by different governments. I recall up to at least when the first time when the UNC came back into power after the double whammy of Patrick Manning's time, up to at least then I recall seeing, different ad campaigns. So you would want to go back to them, ad campaigns, buying up television space, airtime, to educate the public about the importance of taking care of the environment. Revitalizing the whole thing about litter wardens to ensure that people are held accountable when they do engage in littering. And of course, we want to have those public conversations. Some of the organizations affiliated with MSJ and YSJ in particular are youth-led environmental organizations.
Okay, thank you for that. Guys, everyone, we are just approaching.
Hold on. Nikhil has a question about.
Yeah, I was just about to address that.
Great.
I was just about to address that. So we are going to take about the last 4 questions for tonight. So guys, if anybody's question were not answered, kindly email us, go to PrideTT's website and shoot us a message through there, and we would try to have that question answered for you. Before I get to Nikhil's question and one of Rudy's question in the comments, I believe Brandy had a question she wanted to ask pertaining to the trans community and healthcare in terms of transitioning. So Brandy.
Right. There's so much that is going on, and a lot of it is an increase with young persons who are asking more questions around transitioning, and also the hormone replacement therapy. Right now, the Family Planning Association, I'm trying to see if I could get the Ministry of Health to put hormone replacement therapy on the sexual and reproductive health list. And also, I need to know what is this going to be one of the views in terms of supporting medically transitioning persons, and what are your views and what are your party views in terms of support for medically transitioning persons, because we need better healthcare and better support in the health system, because not only for medically transitioning, but also for your original health that you've been assigned to.
So on a personal level, I think that due to various various governments, I think that we have done a disservice to our population in terms of how healthcare is offered to everyone. I think that very few people feel like they are being fully and in good faith, they are being served through our public health systems, right? And I think that when we do start pushing for that health reform, we would want to make sure that everybody gets the care that they need and that they desire, so that if trans people do want to be able to transition, there are doctors who are allowed to give that medical advice. Because my understanding as it is that it can be done privately for you to medically transition. There's like maybe one endocrinologist who does it in South. And we would want to have, firstly, more endocrinologists who are able to then dispense this advice. And we would want to have all of the things in place to ensure that people can have not just the chemical side, the hormone replacement, but also the mental well-being side, so that their transition is holistic and that all of their needs, not just their biological needs, are being met. Because of course, when one of the hardest parts of transitioning is the social transition, because then people just, they are so closed off to the possibility of gender diversity that they don't actually give the support that trans people need. So we want to make sure that all support for trans folks are holistic. We also do believe, for instance, that this position of our current government, that things like PrEP should not be available, make no sense, right? PrEP is not just a gay people thing. Anybody who desires to have unprotected sex should have PrEP available to them, right? And so for him to decide based on some shallow morality and based on maintaining his Christian lobby is unacceptable. And we will be pushing in our health reform to ensure that all of the needs of the community are met. and that systems are in place to meet the needs of the community. Because tying into Nikhil's question, right, mental health care remains one of our biggest problems here. Having passed through the system myself, going to outpatient clinics, I can tell you it's very industrialized. It's very cut and dry. So, you come in, 5-minute talk, get your meds, get out. There's no actual support. And so we would want to make sure that more care is provided by our mental health professionals within the public health service.
Okay, well, I think you answered Nikhil's question as well. So I believe this is our final question for the night. We would like the MSJ to advocate for the review of blood donation regulations, because when we go to donate blood, the form you fill out to donate blood, for the gay men in our community, they have to lie on the form, otherwise they're not going to take the blood, right? So we would like you guys to advocate for that, so that they don't have to lie on the form whether they have sex with a gay man or not. They should be able to donate blood, because I assume in Trinidad the blood is tested before for all for whatever.
Based on horror stories, it's not necessarily tested. However, I do think that is not an indictment on, the men or whoever is donating blood, but rather an indictment on the system. And that's why we need to push for health reform, because you cannot say that, public health is a priority and then you consistently squeeze out different people from accessing public health. That is not how it works. That doesn't make sense. And so I can see the connection, for instance, between talking about PrEP, making PrEP available, and then respecting the science which supports letting members of the community donate blood, right? And so we need to also make sure that whatever policy decisions we make, and this is what we can also advocate as general people, whether or not it's MSJ or any other party, that they make science-led decisions and not necessarily faith-led decisions, which I think is something that a lot of people worry about with the Christian lobby that exists here. Well, not even Christian, but religious lobby that exists here.
Yeah. So you wanted to you wanted to contribute? Okay. Well, I guess that's the Q&A questions for tonight. Karyn, do you have any closing comments, remarks, as such?
Okay, I just wanted to say that, as I said before, political engagement is not something that only, how should we say, how in Washington they talk about these career politicians. Political engagement is not just for the career politicians, right? It's not just a hustle to make a little money off of state funds, right? As citizens, we have a responsibility to be politically engaged and to make decisions that will then propel our society forward, right? We cannot remain in this old system where every 5 years, it's 1 step forward and 2 steps back, because each successive government wants to undo what the other has done. We need to start demanding that our governments make very clear what their guiding ideology is. We need to start demanding that our different parties actually put in the work. And you need to hold us accountable as well. MSJ needs to be held accountable. We will, of course, be listening to our constituents and taking actions guided by what they say. And you should be able to demand that from every political party. It shouldn't require you to have a party card and to go and stand up in party groups for 5 years, 10 years before an issue you want to raise gets heard.
Okay. With that being said, um, I'm going to hand this over to Rudy now for the closing remarks.
Thank you, Shahan. And thank you very much to Karyn Diaz for representing her party, the Movement for Social Justice, and herself very well. I think, Karyn, you came up with to some tough questions on the discussion tonight, but we thought we knew that the MSJ would send someone who would be able to manage these discussions. And we are grateful for your frankness and for the commitments that you gave, of course, to support our community and, of course, the wider community. And we trust that your competitors, as I said in the Gael, will be as forthcoming and frank as you have been. I, we are going to be visiting political parties and their campaigns if that is allowed in the next few weeks based on the regulations and restrictions. So don't be surprised if you see us in mass abundance at one or two of your rallies, because we would like to maintain the conversation and have a presence and listen to. I'm sure there's much more that you would have liked to see that not even 2 hours allows for. Um, on that note, tonight we spoke about a number of issues. As you all should know by now, we will be hosting a series of discussions such as these on a number of topics. We try to provide discourse and activity for even the smallest niche or issue in our community. Tomorrow night, Amanda McIntyre will be participating and moderating a discussion on queer women in literature in Trinidad and Tobago. And she's going to have a lineup of two other amazing authors. You all may know Lisa Allen Agostini, and she's also going to have Paula Obi. So I think that will be a very interesting conversation because, of course, our authors write about our issues, and that discussion will give some further insight into what we face. And then on Friday night, Brandy mentioned, and Karyn as well mentioned, the issue of PrEP. We will be having a discourse, hopefully with a representative of the AIDS Coordinating Committee and FPAT on PrEP and other issues related to HIV/AIDS. And next week, I'm skipping the weekend for spite because if you all want to know what's going on, you have to visit PrideTT's.com. But next week, Tuesday, we're actually having a discussion with leaders of faith across Trinidad and Tobago, where we will be asking them some of these hard questions as well. So again, thank you very much for staying on the chat with us. It's always amazing to me when we come down to the end of it and we have over 20 persons on the Zoom and close to 20 persons on each of the lives, plus all of the other shares that are going on. So thank you very much for your continued support and your interest in Pride TT. And we will be having next week, hopefully, another political party on our Queer Vote Count Town Hall. Visit our website, PrideTT.com, and Instagram for more information. And again, a heartfelt thanks to all of you, our moderator, Shahan of Pride UE, our co-host for these sessions. It's great to see young people taking up the lead, and I'm sure you all can give a round of applause virtually for Shahan. I think this is the first time she did something like this, and she did a marvelous job.
It is.
So thank you very much, and Wade for providing support as well. And again, Karyn, thank you very much. We really appreciated you coming on the call tonight and representing the movement for social justice. So everyone, be safe and happy Pride, and see you all on all the other calls.
Good night, everybody. Happy Pride.
Pride.
Good night, everyone.
Good night, everyone.